Have a nice day, Mr. Edmund. A child holding a broom bowed to Rusty as he stepped out of his lair. It was the older of the two girls who were currently living in his house. Her expression carried a rare smile, although it still looked a bit awkward. The girl standing beside her, however, wore a much more genuine one. Day. Naisha, Mr. Edmund and Gleam need to leave now. But I don't want Gleam to leave. The little girl was playing with Gleam outside the house while the older girl continued sweeping. Rusty had informed them that he was taking an Adventurer Guild quest today. Although the kids were curious about what he did, they still acted awkward whenever they interacted with him. After all, Rusty was still a living armor monster trying to blend in. This was a good opportunity for him to learn how to interact with humanoids, but things didn't always go smoothly. Fortunately, Gleam often served as a helpful icebreaker, although the youngest girl could sometimes be overly clingy. Stop causing trouble, you're a big girl now. After peeling Ria off Gleam, Rusty was finally allowed to leave and check how well he had done on the exams. Even though he had been given all the answers by Burden and Alexander, he still couldn't be sure he had passed. The two guides were smart, far smarter than him, but that didn't guarantee they hadn't made mistakes. Bothersome children. Why are we still keeping them around? A Burden complained as they left their current home. We've already discussed this. Having people who can vouch for Rusty helps maintain his hidden identity. No one would expect a monster to be helping orphans. Alexander replied, though a Burden still didn't agree with the idea. To him, the better option was to leave this land entirely and travel to regions populated by demons. In his mind, the goal was simple: keep killing monsters, grow stronger through natural combat, and eventually dominate the world with unmatched power. Rusty wasn't entirely opposed to that plan, but he preferred a more balanced approach. By becoming an adventurer and using the dungeons to level up, he could grow stronger in a safer, more controlled environment. His body relied on metal, weapons, and mastering the art of craftsmanship, something humans excelled at. As he was leaving, Rusty noticed Rollo leaning against the wall. The young thief gave him a nod, as if trying to imply something. It looked like the boy wanted to say something, but as Rusty passed him, no words were spoken. Rusty didn't stop to ask. He was too focused on moving forward with his plan. Once he became a D-rank adventurer, many opportunities in the city would become available to him. Did you get in? No. Haha, I knew you were too stupid to pass the test. Shut up. When Rusty arrived at the guild, there was a commotion outside. A crowd had gathered around a small board displaying a list of names. Many of the people surrounding it were adventurers he vaguely recognized from the previous day's test. Judging by the number of disappointed expressions and slumped shoulders, it seemed that more than half had failed the written exam and were returning in defeat. Rusty paused for a moment before stepping up to the wooden board. The paper looked cheap, and there were exactly 10 names listed before him. He scanned them quickly, and to his surprise, his name was right at the top, written in a noticeably thicker font. What does that mean? He asked, careful not to point at it. It means you had the top score, Rusty. Alexander replied without hesitation, then as soon as he finished speaking, both of them heard a Burden's cackling echo around them. What did I say? You should be thankful to this demon lord. Without my great ability, this could never happen. Are you thankful? I'm sure you are. Rusty didn't respond, but he felt as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He was somewhat confident in his combat skills, but when it came to knowledge about this world, he still relied heavily on his two guides. This isn't the end of the test. Look at the paper. It says we need to go to the training grounds to begin the second part. Alexander said, cutting off a Burden's moment of gloating as he pointed to the next instruction. The notice outlined the final stage of the D-rank exam, a combat trial against a guild member. Rusty wondered who his opponent would be. He had never faced a D-rank adventurer before. Most people might have felt nervous or intimidated, but he felt only anticipation. After his recent transformation, he had yet to test his new abilities against a worthy opponent. This was the perfect chance to measure his strength against experienced fighters. It's a shame I won't be able to use all of my power, but this should still be interesting. The body he now inhabited resembled the armor worn by seasoned adventurers and was crafted from enchanted twilight steel. He had access to several powerful abilities tied to twilight and the darkness element, which could weaken living beings. However, using those powers against adventurers was out of the question. They were among his most valuable trump cards and best kept hidden for now. He had already revealed them once during the fight with the mercenaries, and using them again would only draw unwanted attention. He couldn't afford that, at least not until he became stronger, possibly not until he reached C rank. It seems we have a few hours to get ready. After making sure that he got the correct time, he waited at the edge of the training grounds, near a shaded section beside the guild wall. The space was large and flat, covered in short grass and surrounded by wooden fencing, clearly reinforced with enchantments. In the center, a series of wooden dummies and old weapon racks stood ready. Since he was a monster that did not need to eat, sleep, or take enjoyment in humanoid hobbies, he simply chose to remain there for the next 2 hours. He used the time to examine the grounds where they were supposedly going to hunt. Eventually, spectators began to arrive, followed by some of the guild staff. The staff removed several of the dummies to clear space for the makeshift arena that would be set up in the center. He remembered the guild in the other city, the one that had a separate section for events like this. It was clear that this place was in desperate need of new equipment. That partly explained the high costs of taking the exams and why they were so difficult to pass. However, it still didn't explain where the money went from all the adventurers, since the training ground didn't appear to have been improved in a long time. This place was meant to be a training ground for younger adventurers and a space to work up a sweat. Yet the training dummies were falling apart, and most of the practice weapons were in poor condition. There seemed to be either a serious lack of funding or something more troubling happening behind the scenes. This could be an opportunity to spread the word. As he examined the shoddy equipment, one of his guides, Alexander, called out to him. "Hey! What do you mean?" he asked, sounding confused. "Look at those practice swords. They're covered in rust, and even the wooden ones are falling apart. What if we supplied the guild with some gear, free of charge? You still have some bronze left, right?" "I suppose I do." Alexander had a point. The training ground was filled with new adventurers. If he provided new equipment, even if it was just basic practice weapons and armor, word might spread about his smithy. That could lead to a steady stream of business, and copying weapons was quite simple. He still had some leftover bronze and copper, and he might even experiment with wood, something he had never fully explored before. However, before he could think it through any further, a loud bell rang out across the training grounds. Someone had just arrived. "Is everyone here?" Eventually, it was time for the test to begin, and the woman named Thelma arrived to make a brief announcement. She stood at the edge of the arena, adjusting her glasses before raising a clipboard in her hands. Her tone remained calm, but the way she scanned the gathered examinees made it clear she wasn't here for small talk. "We'll be starting shortly. When your name is called, step forward and enter the ring. Each of you will face our assigned examiner. You are to fight until you are disarmed, incapacitated, or you surrender. Are there any questions?" she asked while adjusting her glasses. Rusty stayed quiet, but someone in the group raised a hand. "What if we make the examiner surrender, or injure them? Or even kill them? Will we be held responsible?" Rusty appreciated the question. The woman hadn't mentioned what would happen if a test taker actually won the fight. It was as if they didn't believe anyone here was strong enough to make that outcome possible. Thelma paused, then gave a short, dismissive reply. "In a rare case of a test taker defeating their examiner, they will still pass. But if you intentionally kill a guild member, the punishment will be severe. Injuries are acceptable. Death is not. However, this test is not about winning, you are just here to show us your abilities." The message was clear. While winning was technically possible, no one was expected to achieve it. The examiners were selected for a reason, and the guild did not take chances with its own personnel. To make matters worse, this was not even a proper duel. It was enough to be accepted by the examiner, which meant the fight could be cut short at any time. Rusty had hoped to test a portion of his strength, but the humanoids overseeing the trial would likely end the match early if things became too intense. Even so, he still wanted to see what a D-rank adventurer was capable of. The person assigned to judge them soon stepped forward. The man who entered the ring wore simple dark trousers and a green shirt that didn't fit quite right, as if he had pulled it from someone else's laundry pile. His messy brown hair looked like he had just rolled out of bed, and his relaxed expression made it seem as if he didn't have a care in the world. A few of the adventurers waiting in line exchanged glances, clearly unimpressed. Still, everyone noticed the strange-looking dog. The creature following the man was nearly the size of a horse, with a body that looked like a cross between a Great Dane and a Mastiff. Its short, midnight black coat shimmered slightly with each movement, revealing muscles far too dense for any normal animal. There was no leash holding it back, but a collar rested around its neck with a single letter, D. No one said we would be fighting a monster like that. Look at the size of those teeth. Is it a D-rank tamed monster? Is that what the D stands for? The other adventurers began murmuring as soon as the monster entered. Gleam, who was sitting on Rusty's shoulder, perked up and glanced at the canine with suspicion. It was as if she were sizing him up and judging if she could defeat him in the coming battle. The murmurs grew louder when the first match began. A young man with light armor and a curved sword stepped into the ring. He was confident, maybe too confident, and waved at the examiner with a wide grin. Let's make this quick, old man. Old man? I'm only 28. The examiner responded with a shrug and a shake of his head. In his right hand, he held a simple-looking short sword that appeared quite dull. In his left hand was something unusual, a piece of bread topped with some meat, which he continued to chew even after stepping into the temporary guild arena. The younger adventurer's face turned red when he realized the examiner was underestimating him. The monstrous dog, which had already raised everyone's suspicions, was not even participating in the battle. It sat in the corner, calmly chewing on a piece of meat. Clearly, neither the adventurer nor the dog showed much interest in the fight. The young adventurer rushed forward, trying to capitalize on the examiner's apparent laziness. He closed the distance in 3 quick steps and slashed at the man's shoulder. The examiner sidestepped easily, still chewing on his food, and slapped the flat of his dull sword against the boy's side. It wasn't even a real strike, more like a playful tap, but the moment it connected, the young man collapsed. His limbs gave out as if all the strength had been drained from his body. Ugh! A burst of food spilled from the man's mouth as he collapsed to the ground. The adventurers waiting in line to take the test cried out in surprise, while those who had come just to watch the chaos cheered together. There it is! No one can beat Melville. Ha, I bet none of them will pass the test. But that happened last time. Some of them have to pass, right? Want to bet on it? Rusty listened to the people around him placing bets on who would pass and who wouldn't. The strike had looked lazy at first, but this man named Melville was clearly strong. That's not a regular D-rank adventurer. They're not making it easy for the new recruits. Alexander commented as they continued to watch the one-sided beating unfold before them. One by one, the examinees stepped into the ring with hopeful eyes and left it coughing in the dirt. Melville never changed his expression. He didn't break a sweat, didn't draw blood, and didn't raise his voice. He simply moved with minimal effort and tapped each fighter in just the right place to make them collapse or give up. The pattern repeated again and again until the second-to-last examinee appeared. A spear-wielding woman proved to be more of a challenge. She caught his blade with her weapon and swept it aside several times. Their battle was the only one to continue for a full minute before she staggered backward while clutching her neck. You show some promise. I had to use a bit more of my strength, maybe even 5%. You pass. Although she had lost, she was the first person to receive a passing grade. Now, Rusty was the only one left. It seemed they had started the test in the reverse order of who had done best on the written exam. As the one with the highest score, Rusty would be the last to face this unbeatable examiner, and he could barely contain his lust for battle. The man had not yet shown his true battle prowess, and Rusty was determined to be the one who forced him to do so. The guild is pulling a scam again. Be quiet. What if they hear you? But how else do you explain this? Only one person passed, and that guy doesn't even look strong. I bet he's all skin and bones under that armor. Rusty didn't turn his head as the whispers continued around him. The moment had come for him to step into the spotlight. He moved forward, the sound of his armored boots pressing into the dead grass surrounding the makeshift arena. The murmuring began to die down. Bets had already been placed, and clearly not many believed he had a real chance at victory. His opponent, a man named Melville, stood off to the side holding a half-eaten piece of bread. After every fight, he would wander away and grab something to eat. His build was lanky, which didn't make much sense. With the amount of food he consumed, he should have been much heavier, yet somehow he stayed thin. I agree. They aren't taking us very seriously, but that's a good thing, Gleam. His ant companion was perched on his shoulder and jumped to the ground for the time being. This challenge wasn't only about personal fighting skills, and using tamed monsters was perfectly acceptable. Not everyone excelled at solo combat, which made this test feel somewhat odd. A person specializing in a support class would certainly struggle against a close-range fighter, but perhaps those individuals were undergoing a different kind of assessment. From what he had seen, every participant in the combat test so far had been some type of fighter. He has a class that I haven't seen before. While observing from a distance, he decided to take a closer look at the man's class. Since the man was not currently engaged in combat, he felt confident that no one would notice he was gathering information about his next opponent. Classification: Martial Artist L9. Type: Human. The humanoid inhabitants of this world operated under a different power structure than monsters. Monsters evolved through ranks and changed not only in strength but also in form. A human like the one he was currently facing did not transform outwardly. Their growth occurred internally, and to his knowledge, they couldn't advance on their own. Instead, they needed some kind of divine artifact or specialized skill, usually found within the temples of this world. Once someone reached a certain level threshold, they could acquire a new class, but they had to visit a temple to complete the process. What made this even more intriguing was that they had some degree of choice in their progression, something most monsters did not enjoy. Gleam, who was bonded to him through a contract, could also benefit from this system, but was not restricted by it, as recent events showed. Most natural monsters evolved randomly, and creatures like him, who could choose their next form, were exceedingly rare. Surprisingly, this person's class was not that of a beast tamer. The monster dog that followed him appeared to be a companion, similar to Gleam. Instead, he was a martial artist, a fighter expected to rely on his hands, yet for some reason, he wielded a dull training sword. His body movements were clearly unusual, but having the opportunity to observe him from a distance, Rusty managed to understand the pattern behind them. Rusty was no longer at E rank, and his senses had sharpened to some degree. Even so, he remained unsure of what the man was hiding, since he had yet to take anyone seriously. From what Rusty knew, there was a structure to how humanoids acquired their classes. The first two class stages were kept at 25 levels each. A level 25 fighter could then advance to a better class, one considered equivalent in strength to an E-rank monster. While this new class had its own level system, there was also a concept known as cumulative level. For example, a fighter who became a sword fighter and reached the cap of 25 levels in both classes would have a cumulative level of 50. At that point, they could qualify for a more powerful class, one that took both previous classes into account and offered much greater strength. This was one of the key differences between humans and monsters. There could come a point when a person failed to qualify for a higher tier class. To keep advancing, they had to meet certain requirements, which could include leveling specific skills to a threshold, earning special titles, or unlocking hidden achievements. Guild records explained that those who chose easily accessible classes often reached an unbreakable plateau. True advancement required striving for excellence. Choosing the weakest options might allow for rapid early progress, but this approach often trapped adventurers at C rank. Reaching B rank and beyond was much harder, and those who did were considered elite. Their numbers were far smaller compared to the broader adventurer population. The person Rusty was about to face was in his third class, someone who could be considered nearly a veteran adventurer. Rusty stepped fully into the ring, his halberd resting lightly in his hands. The weight meant nothing to him. Though the weapon looked similar to his previous model, it now had magical circles engraved in several places, containing the enchantment he had gained from his battle with the Lightning Tiger. One enchantment had been placed on his helmet to protect his core, while the other had been embedded into the weapon itself. The experience talismans he had received were now fully used, allowing him to reach level 2 of D rank instantly. He was finally ready for battle, but his opponent was still not taking the whole thing seriously. "Let's get this over with. I'm getting hungry." His hair was a mess and he scratched his unshaven chin. As he yawned and slowly walked toward the center of the arena, he gave the impression of someone uninterested and sluggish. Rusty had seen this act 9 times before and knew it was nothing more than a ruse. The man always appeared lazy and unimpressive, but he was consistently prepared. He would expose himself to attacks on purpose to manipulate how his opponents fought. Rusty was not going to fall for it. Before the man could pull the same trick again, Rusty charged forward. He could not use skills like Twilight's Embrace to boost his stats, but he still had others. Fury, a skill he had absorbed from a monster, was one of them. He combined it with the dash skill to close the distance in an instant. The match had officially begun the moment they stepped into the arena, so it was not considered a cheap shot. For the first time, Melville's eyes widened in genuine surprise as a halberd came hurtling toward his face. Whoa! This time it was not an act. He barely managed to raise his dull sword in time to block. His body reacted on instinct, dodging to the side and parrying the blow. The moment he did, the sheer force behind the strike became clear. His sword trembled under the pressure, and a sharp sound rang out from the clash, followed by an eruption of gasps and shouts from the watching crowd. The man who looked like an invincible examiner was now being pushed back. The halberd moved forward at strange angles that didn't match any formal technique. It twisted and danced, as though Rusty was wielding a snake. Melville backpedaled, his half-eaten bread long forgotten on the ground behind him. His relaxed posture was gone. The faintest flicker of amusement at the corner of his lips was replaced with a frown. "Hey now, hold on for a..." Rusty could still hear him talking while he struck again. The man seemed to be using his voice as a tactic, an intentional effort to provoke the other adventurers and test their composure. It was likely an attempt to see if anger would override their focus. This could have worked on humanoids, but Rusty was not one of them. He was simply living enchanted twilight steel. Soon, the blade that had been used to parry the heavy halberd strikes shattered into pieces, drawing looks of astonishment from the other adventurers. Although Rusty appeared to be gaining the upper hand, he still could not finish the fight. Even after his opponent lost the blade and Rusty continued attacking, his strikes failed to land cleanly. His opponent was adapting, finding a rhythm, and gradually revealing his true fighting style. "Not bad. Maybe it's time I use a quarter of my strength now." After dodging several powerful blows, Melville flipped backward, landing several meters away from the clash. Rusty had to stop himself as he neared the edge of the arena. He glanced behind and noticed the examiner inspecting the hilt that remained from the broken practice sword. "They won't charge me for this, right?" The man scratched his head and eventually tossed the loose strands of hair aside. His green shirt was torn in several places, though no blood had been drawn. As he continued speaking about how he was still holding back his true strength, so was Rusty. It was frustrating that he couldn't unleash his full power against such a powerful opponent, but retreat was not an option. Both men quickly took up battle stances and the fight resumed. Melville was the one pressing forward now. He unleashed a barrage of rapid kicks and punches. Rusty knew that his halberd gave him a range advantage against an unarmed opponent, but if the fight got too close, he would be at a disadvantage. He relied on quick thrusts and fast swings to keep the examiner at a distance, though it was clear he was being pushed back. "They're really going at it. What was that guy's name again? I think it was Edmund. If he's giving Melville this much trouble, he must be strong. Should I ask him to join our party?" "Join yours? He should join mine." The adventurers around them began to talk among themselves. It was clear that Rusty was starting to stand out. His halberd swept through the air with devastating force, carving deep grooves into the dirt. Melville moved along the edges of those arcs, his body weaving in and out like flowing water. "It feels like I'm a step behind. If I could only use all of my skills." The battle was becoming increasingly frustrating. His opponent kept raising the pace, and he couldn't keep up. A large portion of his abilities had to remain sealed if he wanted to avoid drawing attention. But if this continued, he would lose. He searched through every tactic he had learned, trying to find any path to victory that wouldn't make the adventurers start asking questions. To make matters worse, he did not even have a chance to activate his lightning enchantment. The man was moving so quickly that he was forced onto the defensive with no opportunity for a proper counterattack. Even if he had activated it, he knew it would only waste a charge. Just as Melville's strike was about to crash into his helmet and he was finally preparing to activate the enchantment in a last-ditch effort to defend himself, a loud chime echoed through the arena. The instant he heard it, the examiner's expression shifted, and a familiar woman's voice followed. "That's enough. Isn't it?" Although the voice was not very strong, the examiner looked at the woman in glasses with an awkward, sheepish smile. It resembled a mother scolding her child caught with a hand in the cookie jar. Rusty froze the moment he saw the man lose all desire to fight. The woman named Thelma, who appeared entirely unthreatening, somehow made this powerful man lower his head as if he had done something wrong. "Mr. Melville, hasn't this gone on long enough?" She adjusted her large glasses and raised an eyebrow, which made the man shrink back even more. "Yes, I suppose it has. She nodded and waited. Several seconds passed before the man realized he had not said what he was supposed to. He turned toward Rusty, who raised his weapon again, expecting another attack, but instead received praise. "You pass," Melville said, finally straightening his back and brushing dust off his pants. I was gonna say it earlier, but things got interesting. The murmurs in the crowd erupted again. People were craning their necks to get a better view of Rusty, or rather his metal armor, since none of his actual body was visible. A few glimpses of his pale, possessed face had flashed behind the visor earlier, but that was all. Now that he had finally achieved the rank of D-rank adventurer, which was the goal he had come here for, he felt strangely hollow. Rusty slowly lowered his halberd. He was supposed to feel proud. This moment should have marked a personal victory. Instead, frustration weighed heavily against his chest plate. He hadn't truly won. Not in any meaningful sense. He had pushed Melville harder than most ever had, perhaps even forced him to take the duel seriously, but he had never landed a decisive blow. That was a good warm-up, Melville said, making Rusty feel even angrier than before. It's been a while since someone made me sweat a little. Rusty said nothing. He had no words for this hollow achievement. Eventually, he turned away and walked toward the edge of the field where Thelma waited. The duel might have been over, but a few formalities still needed to be handled. Well then, she said as he approached. Give me your card. You can pick it up in a few hours, Mr. Edmund. The process won't take long. Rusty nodded. Only one other person had passed the strange exam, and with just 2 cards to prepare, the wait time would likely be short. He reached into his pocket and handed over the thin identification card. Thelma took it and turned to head back into the guild hall. Congratulations on your victory, Rusty. Alexander congratulated him, but Rusty didn't feel much like celebrating. Yet. For a brief moment, he considered what to do next. With a few hours to spare, he could head home and check in on the kids, or he could wait at the guild and then head into the dungeon for another expedition. But before he could decide, he felt a tap on his shoulder. After turning around, he was surprised to find not just one person but a small crowd of adventurers standing behind him. Hey, want to join my party? We could use someone like you. No, join ours instead. Back off, I asked first. Too bad, get in line. A growing line of adventurers had formed behind him. For reasons he couldn't quite understand, they all wanted the same thing, for Rusty to join their team. He had apparently gained some fame, although he wasn't sure if that was a good thing. Yeah, I wish they would stop bothering Gleam. If this keeps up, my possession skill might run out. Rusty spoke while glancing at Gleam, who snapped her mandibles at the people getting too close. A large crowd had gathered around them, many reaching out to touch his ant companion without her consent. The guild test had ended, and he was now officially a D-rank adventurer, but he had not expected this much attention to follow. Rusty stood still, surrounded by a dozen voices, offers, and flashing smiles. Each one was trying to outdo the last. Adventurers from every corner of the guild hall were vying for his attention, tossing around terms like equal loot split, fast track to C rank, and exclusive dungeon routes. Some had even gone so far as to offer housing, free potions, or an executive spot in their parties. Gleam chittered loudly and hopped back between his shoulders to escape the poking fingers. One adventurer tried to pet her anyway, a mistake he wouldn't soon forget. Chomp! Ow! What the hell? That bug bit me. I warned you. Rusty muttered while pushing the people away and making more space for himself and her. She's not a mascot. She's my partner, so leave her alone. Only now did he realize that waiting in the guild had been a mistake. He had assumed that after a few minutes the adventurers would lose interest and stop crowding around him, but it seemed that D-ranked adventurers were rare even here. There were only a handful in the area, and C-ranked parties were non-existent. The man he had faced during the exam appeared to be somewhere within D-rank but above the norm. Just like with monster evolutions, there were different tiers to classes. If Rusty could consider himself an elite monster, then that man was likely in the same category. Although he was confident he could win if he used all of his skills, the fight would still be far from easy. He understood that his journey to the top was far from over, and D-rank was just another stepping stone along the way. What is it now? Just as he was about to move to another corner of the guild, a few individuals approached him. He raised his voice, mimicking what humans called annoyance, and the 3 adventurers immediately recoiled. They dropped their heads and began bowing for some reason. When he looked at them more closely, something about them seemed familiar. The moment one of them raised their head, he remembered. Aren't you those weak adventurers from before? He blurted it out without thinking, and he saw one of the 3 lower their cat-shaped ears in disappointment. Why yes, That's us. Ah, your name was Oliver, right? Oh, you remembered us, Senior. Senior. The trio of young adventurers before him were the same ones who had been stationed with him during the monster attack. If he remembered correctly, the other two with Oliver were named Tally and Rika. It looked like they had come to speak with him, though it probably was not to invite him to join their party. Their levels were clearly too low for that. Instead, they seemed to have a different reason. Why yes, we just wanted to congratulate you on reaching D rank, and thank you for taking care of us back at the wall. This time it was Tally who spoke. She seemed nervous, but her words were sincere. Rusty looked at the three, unsure of what they truly wanted or why they were calling him their senior. Still, the word had a nice ring to it, and the meaning was not lost on him. It meant they saw him as someone above them, and he liked that idea. About that? Think nothing of it. It's the least a senior like me could do in that situation. He lifted his helmet slightly, as if soaking in the praise. While the other adventurers around him clearly wanted something, these three felt more genuine. They did not seem to have any ulterior motives. But before the conversation could continue, another group approached, 3 individuals who were clearly above E rank. So you are Edmund, the new D rank adventurer. They looked like a seasoned party of adventurers, equipped with enchanted gear, something only D ranks and above could typically afford. They carried an air of superiority, and the moment they arrived, the mood in the guild shifted. The surrounding adventurers quickly averted their gazes, as if struck by fear. The trio he had been speaking with was shoved aside, and Rika, the third member of the group, nearly fell to the ground. Hey! She was caught by Olivier, but the 4 people didn't seem to care. They simply shoved them aside without a second thought. Leading the group was a large man clad in heavy armor, even bulkier than the kind Rusty wore. To his left stood another large man, resembling the well-built barbarians Rusty had seen in the tribe, though something about him was different. That difference suggested he wasn't from there, probably a member of a different tribe. Another member was a slender woman with short, sharp red hair and piercing eyes. A bow was strapped across her back, and a dozen throwing knives lined her belt. Her gaze swept over Rusty as if assessing the value of every piece of his gear, then silently deciding none of it quite measured up. The last member stood at the rear, looking like someone from the Thieves' Guild. He wore light leather armor with faded symbols stitched along the sleeves. Several small pouches dangled from his belt, likely filled with poisons, tools, or enchanted trinkets. His hood was pulled low, but Rusty could still see his eyes scanning for weak spots in his armor. Be careful, Rusty. There's something off about these 4. Yes, I know. Alexander had spoken, and Rusty agreed. He understood more about the world now and wouldn't be so easily deceived. Something about this group felt wrong, especially considering they already had 2 fighters. Their party didn't seem to need someone like him, which made their interest in him all the more suspicious. Rusty didn't move, and his halberd remained strapped across his back. While these people were clearly suspicious, they would not attack him inside the guild. If a fight broke out, they would all end up in a jail cell or have to pay a hefty fine. The one who approached was the armored man. His helmet was down, and like many humanoids in this world, he had a bushy beard that looked unkempt. We've seen your fight, the man said. His voice was gravelly yet smooth, conveying the confidence of someone accustomed to giving orders. Name's Barrows. This is my party, Sable, Gran, and Nyril. He motioned to each of them in turn, but none offered greetings. They only gave short nods. Compared to the interactions he had just experienced with other adventurers, this felt more irritating. It was as if they were looking down on him. Good day. He offered them a polite greeting. There was no reason to make enemies of these people, at least not yet. They seemed confident in their abilities, though none of them felt as strong as the man he had just fought. I won't waste your time, friend. Here's the deal. My party is looking for someone like you. You seem capable, someone who can handle the deeper parts of the sunken dungeon. So join us. The adventurers surrounding them remained silent, but it was clear they were intimidated by this group of 4. Each member was a D-rank adventurer, veterans who had been descending into the dungeon for some time. Rusty considered the situation. His body had recently advanced, and he was planning to explore the dungeon anyway. Traveling with others might make the journey easier. Working alongside adventurers instead of going solo could also reduce suspicion about his true nature, though it came with risks. His identity might be exposed, and his current adventurer armor form restricted many of his abilities. Without access to his other two forms, the danger of being discovered in combat grew even greater. He also knew that high-ranking adventurers were better at sensing monsters. If something gave him away during a fight, there would be no way to explain it. Sharing loot and experience was another drawback. He was far more efficient on his own. Perhaps in rare situations, he could assist a party against higher-level threats, but for standard dungeon crawling, he saw no benefit in teaming up. Especially now that he had acquired a skill allowing him to control lesser versions of his body, which he was eager to test in real combat. My apologies, but I'm not looking for a party. I prefer to work alone. He tried to keep his tone courteous, but the man's expression changed the moment he heard the answer. Really? Won't you reconsider? It gets dangerous down there. You shouldn't be wandering around by yourself. The large man placed a hand on Rusty's shoulder as if to pat it, but then Rusty felt it. The grip tightened slowly, pressing down on his steel frame with increasing force. This was no longer a friendly invitation. It was a demand. Gleam moved her head up, and her antennae moved back in annoyance. She was ready to pounce. No. I won't. Rusty didn't appreciate the aggression. He raised his hand and pushed against the man's arm. It turned into a contest of strength. To the man's surprise, his hand was forced off Rusty's shoulder. For a brief moment, his eyes flashed with hostility, but the look quickly faded. A smile returned to his face as he withdrew his hand. I see. That's a shame. If you change your mind, you'll know where to find us, friend. It was as if the man had two personalities. One was that of a calm veteran, while the other seemed to lurk beneath the surface, a more violent nature that might have been his true self. As Barrows turned away, his party followed him in silence. Gran, the brutish warrior, gave Rusty a long look that seemed to be part warning and part challenge. The archer, Sable, narrowed her eyes before slipping into the crowd without a word. Nyril, the thief, was the last to leave. His hooded face remained unreadable, yet for some reason he lingered the longest before moving on. What was that about? Shhh, be quiet, Rika. They might hear you. Once the group had left, Rika was the first to speak. Tally quickly covered her mouth to silence her and only removed her hand once she was sure the intimidating D-rank adventurer party had exited the guild. Oliver took a cautious step forward, his voice low as he leaned closer to Rusty. Mr. Edmund, you should be careful. I should. Yes. That guy, Barrows, he's dangerous. Dangerous, hey? Don't worry, I can handle myself. If they want to come at me, they can. I won't run away. Rusty stood tall with his metal chest pushed forward. The sight made Oliver pause. The young man was clearly trying to warn him against making enemies of the other group, but Rusty didn't care. In fact, he would have welcomed a fight, especially if it happened in a place where he could unleash his full power. No, why you don't understand. A lot of adventurers who teamed up with them never seemed to come back. Oh. Oliver continued to warn him, though Rusty didn't understand why this human cared so much. The concern was starting to annoy him. It felt like he was being underestimated. He placed a firm hand on the young man's shoulder and gave it a light squeeze. Don't worry about me. Worry more about yourself. Ah. I'm sorry. I seem to have overstepped. My apologies. The young man lowered his head respectfully. Then Alexander's voice echoed in Rusty's mind. Don't be too hard on the kid. He's just worried those four will target you in the dungeon for refusing to join their party. Is he? Rusty looked at the young man standing before him and tried to imagine what another adventurer might say in a moment like this. Some words of encouragement seemed appropriate. Rusty tilted his head slightly, his visor catching the light just enough to flash those dead eyes that were inside. He could see the young man flinch a bit at the sight of them. Then after a few silent moments, which were enough to make Oliver fidget, he finally spoke out. Thanks, for the warning. I'll be careful. His voice wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. Still, the message seemed to have gotten through. Olivier blinked in surprise and responded with a firm nod. At that moment, Rusty let go of his shoulder and noticed someone waving at him nearby. It was Thelma, holding something up in her hand. It looked like a card of some sort, and it was most likely what he had been waiting for over an hour. Now that he had a reason to move, he approached the counter, and the card was handed to him. Is this? Yes, this is your new adventurer card, Mr. Edmund. Congratulations on officially becoming a D-rank adventurer. I should remind you that if you lose your card, you can have it reissued here, though it will come with a higher fee. I see. Rusty took the card in his hands and examined it. It didn't look much different from the last one. The main changes were a more intricate frame and the addition of the D symbol. Finally, let's get out of here. A burden's voice echoed inside his helmet. They had been cooped up for too long, and Rusty agreed. The next step was to check the shops and observe what the competition was doing. Once that was done, it would be time to return to the dungeon. He needed to test his body thoroughly, and for that, he needed the monsters inside. He began walking outside. Some people still glanced at him, but it seemed they had finally given up on asking him to join their parties. As soon as he stepped outside, his helmet jerked slightly to one side. He stood still for a few moments, then turned and walked toward the merchant district. It must have been my imagination. For a brief moment, he could have sworn he felt a presence, as if someone or something were watching him with hostile intent. He dismissed it, blaming the feeling on all the frustrated adventurers who were angry that he refused to join their groups. Let's check out that enchanted gear. Gleam cheered, and together they headed toward the shops. Their next goal was to investigate prices and evaluate the equipment. Rusty strode forward, his armored frame clanking softly as he made his way down the cobbled path toward the merchant district. Gleam perched comfortably on his shoulder with her legs tucked beneath her shiny carapace, her antennae twitching with curiosity. The sun had reached its zenith and swept away all the shadows. The streets buzzed with activity while merchants shouted to attract new customers. Despite the noise, Rusty kept his eyes fixed on the shop from which he had once been thrown out. He pushed the door open with pride and marched inside, his chest puffed out, his steps broad and exaggerated. It was a theatrical walk that mimicked the strut of wealthy merchants he had observed. Instantly, all eyes turned to him. Just as before, he headed straight for the door that led to the back of the store and knocked. The door slit opened once again, and the same pair of eyes peered out, narrowing slightly as they recognized him. You again? The guard grumbled, clearly not expecting to see Rusty back so soon. Didn't I tell you? Rusty held up his new adventurer card before the man could finish. The D-rank symbol gleamed faintly in the light. Humph. The guard paused and leaned forward, scrutinizing the card with a trained eye before muttering. How did you? Never mind, wait here. With a click, the slit closed again. A few seconds passed. Then came the sound of locks turning and a heavier thud as the reinforced door was unbarred. It creaked open, revealing the other part of the store within. The guard, now slightly more respectful, stepped aside and gestured for Rusty to enter. You can come in, but remember, if you touch and break any of the items, you have to buy them. Rusty glanced inside and nodded. Sure. Finally, he stepped inside. Before, he had been turned away, but now, with the help of a small card that signified a touch of prestige, the path lay open to him. He still didn't fully understand why humanoid creatures divided themselves so rigidly, but for now, he had to respect their pecking order. This likely wouldn't be the first or last time he would need to collect credentials to reach more exclusive places. If he intended to use humans to accelerate his progress, he would need to play along with their rules. To his surprise, the guard said nothing about his companion relieving herself on his shoulder, which immediately delighted Gleam. She was also quite curious about the items gathered in the shop. The reason was most likely the store motto, if his friend broke anything, he would have to pay for it. It was possible the store owner even counted on this, since selling something a tamed beast happened to knock over would be easy enough. There weren't only enchanted weapons for fighters but also various other objects, including books filled with magical knowledge and skill books. Unfortunately, they were both monsters, and monsters couldn't gain skills from books, no matter how tempting the pages seemed. Make sure to remember all the prices, a burden. Of course. A burden replied while Rusty began examining each item carefully. Rusty still relied on his guide to remember every price, enchantment level and material quality, and to match each detail with a value. Once they returned home, he planned to write everything down in a notebook before deciding what to do with his own smithy. Although the idea hadn't seemed worthwhile at first, he realized it would be a waste not to use his item copying ability to earn a few extra coins. He only needed to make one weapon in order to copy it. With such a quick way to bypass the crafting process, he could spend most of his time grinding in the dungeon and only dedicate a few hours a day to selling items. He also wanted to improve his smithing skills, and taking on tasks from real customers would give him more practical experience than creating items within the Soul Forge. He was still inexperienced and unsure of what people actually wanted, something he would only discover once his shop opened. Now let's see what we have here, which enchantments have the most mana on them. The first time he visited this store, he had only managed to catch a glimpse of what was inside. Most of the items were kept behind glass cases, each accompanied by a detailed description explaining what it was and which enchantments were etched into it. Rusty also had his mana sense skill, and with it, identifying the items carrying the highest mana concentration was relatively easy. The items with the strongest mana signatures usually held the most powerful enchantments. He soon began browsing the displays. The first weapon he came across was a case filled with swords. They were all identical in shape and carried the same enchantment. Sharpness enchantment. More like the lesser sharpness enchantment. Who even buys these failed products? A burden remarked as Rusty examined the 5 swords lying side by side. Rusty wasn't sure what his guide was complaining about, but then Alexander spoke up as well. The person who made these wasn't very skilled. Some of the etchings are uneven. And they're charging an entire gold coin for one of these. The price did seem steep. From what Rusty understood, this enchantment simply sharpened the blade and enhanced its cutting efficiency. Mana would fill certain gaps in the steel and smooth them out during use, but the effect wouldn't last long and wouldn't strengthen the blade itself. Still, some monsters were highly resistant to physical attacks, and even a low-level sharpness enchantment like this could mean the difference between life and death. If the craftsman wasn't very skilled, could I make it too? Rusty studied the patterns on the sword using his mana sense. Ordinary people wouldn't be able to clearly see the magic circles that had been etched into the blade, but he could. If you can remember what the enchantment looks like, then in theory you should be able to copy it. It won't be easy, though. First, you'd need to replicate it exactly. Do you think you can manage that? Alexander asked while Rusty leaned in closer to the glass case containing the swords. All of them had the same enchantment, but the placement of the patterns wasn't consistent. In theory, that meant he was seeing the full enchantment spread across the different blades. Still, retaining all that information and replicating it later in his own smithy would be difficult. I don't think I can, but could you two do it and then explain it to me later? He directed the question to both of his guides. He knew Aberdan had a photographic memory, and Alexander had once been a master craftsman. If the two of them worked with him, they could help him copy not only this sharpness enchantment but also all the others that were being sold in the store. I can, but I'm not sure if our little hero is up to the challenge. Aberdan mocked Alexander slightly, but Alexander wasn't impressed by the shallow attempt to provoke him. He responded in a similar tone. If our little demon lord can draw a schematic of the magic circles involved, I should be able to convert it into a proper enchantment diagram. That's great. Can you see it like this, or should I lean closer? Are you interested in one of the swords, good sir? As Rusty leaned closer to the glass case, a man approached him. He wasn't one of the guards, instead, he looked like a merchant or perhaps an appraiser. He wore a tailored vest with gold trim and large square-shaped glasses. His smile was polite, but Rusty sensed it wasn't genuine. I was just admiring the enchantments. Do you have more of these, and could I see them up close? This seemed like a good opportunity. Glancing at the weapons through the case was impractical, it was much easier to assess them when holding the item directly. The merchant gave Rusty a curious look. It was clear he wasn't used to adventurers taking such a deep interest in the enchantments themselves, since most cared only about power or price. Still, he was a businessman first, and a potential sale was a potential sale. Of course, sir. The merchant said smoothly. These are from our entry-tier enchanted line, but if you are looking for something more refined, I can show you the masterwork selection nearby. Masterwork? Of course, let me see them. The man's eyes glistened when he heard Rusty raise his voice in apparent enthusiasm. He quickly led him to another display case, which he opened with a key. From within, he took out a one-handed mace and began to speak. This is called an impact mace. It's one of our best products. Rusty examined the weapon and immediately noticed that the mana around it was slightly denser, but not by much. Just as he expected, his guide spoke up. Don't be fooled, Rusty. This enchantment isn't much better than the other one. This is no masterwork. It's just a lesser impact enchantment. It was obvious that the merchant was exaggerating the quality of the item. But Rusty wasn't here to make a purchase. He was only testing the stock of his competitors. He didn't even have enough money to buy a small enchanted dagger. Can I hold it? Of course, dear customer. Please try it out, but do be careful. Rusty took the mace in his hand, weighing it slowly. The balance was decent, but it wasn't much better than what he could craft himself. Rather than swinging it around, he inspected it from every angle. Then, to the surprise of the merchant, he simply handed it back. Did you get it? Do you have to ask? Good. Rusty replied to a burden and then looked at the merchant, a glint appearing in his visor. Could I see some more of these masterworks? He asked calmly, and although the man looked slightly confused, he didn't seem discouraged. With a polite nod, he returned the mace to the display case and moved on to the next item, which was a larger sword with a different enchantment. This great sword has a lightning enchantment. It's one of our best-selling weapons and works very well against the monsters inside the dungeon. Oh! Rusty pretended to be impressed and examined the sword. Aquatic monsters were usually weak to lightning elemental damage. Although this enchantment countered his own abilities, he had already taken precautions to protect his core from electrical attacks. He probably wouldn't need or use the sword himself, but that didn't stop him from planning to replicate the enchantment and sell it back at his own smithy. To his knowledge, this was a much simpler version of the enchantment he had placed on his halberd and possibly simple enough for him to replicate. This is good. I knew you had a sharp eye, sir. Would you like me to? Before the man could finish his sentence, Rusty shoved the sword back into his hands and interrupted. Let me see the next one. The man's eyebrows twitched. It was clear that he was starting to grow irritated, but he refused to let it show. He straightened up quickly, regained his composure, and changed his approach. He pointed toward a shield hanging on the wall. This shield comes equipped with a mana barrier enchantment. This is great, I could use a mana barrier enchantment. You could? Then. Yes. Let me see the next one. This is how the next hour went by for Rusty. The merchant's patience wore thinner with each passing minute. By the time Rusty finished inspecting a 12th item without showing the faintest sign of purchasing anything, the man's smile had morphed into a menacing frown. Gleam, on the other hand, was utterly delighted. She wiggled her antennae every time a new item was revealed, her eyes glowing with innocent curiosity. That's enough. Hey? But the next ite? No more items. If you're not going to buy anything, then get out. Finally, the man lost it. Rusty tilted his helmet, pretending to be confused. He had managed to examine a good amount of enchantments, but there were still some left to be seen. But I thought you said I could see them all. That was before I realized you were wasting my time. The merchant snapped, his voice strained. This is a business, not a museum for broke adventurers. Do you even have enough money to buy a single item? The man glanced at the satchel strapped to Rusty's side. It was clear this was as far as Rusty could go. There wasn't enough money in the bag to convince the merchant otherwise. I don't need to take this from you. Rusty was no longer a newborn. Instead of apologizing for his deception, he chose to do what the humanoids often did. He lied and doubled down. He acted offended and stormed out of the store. Rusty shoved the door open with more force than necessary, drawing the attention of a few customers loitering near the entrance. Gleam let out a chirping whine in protest as she was jostled on his shoulder, but Rusty didn't slow down. His armored feet clanked as he stomped back into the bustling streets. Haha, not bad, Rusty. I see you're starting to learn. A burden was elated to see Rusty behaving this way. The man trying to sell him items wore a surprised expression but ultimately said nothing about his behavior. That went better than expected. I should go to all the other stores now. Are you sure, Rusty? I think we have enough information for now. Alexander commented, but Rusty didn't listen. He marched off to another store and used the same tactic wherever he found enchanted items. At first, it worked again. However, the longer he kept it up, the angrier the merchants became. Eventually, he was kicked out of one shop after another until there were no more stores left for him. As Rusty emerged from the final store, a large boot print was on the back of his armor, courtesy of the last furious shopkeeper. His notoriety had grown in the small city, but he had achieved what he came for. Armed with this information, he returned home. Now he could finally create his plan to take over the city. According to his guides, the quality of local weaponry was not very high. That meant establishing himself as a powerful magical blacksmith might not be as difficult as he had first imagined. Take care, Mr. Edmund. Remember, you need to pay for the permit first and also cover the registration fee for your craftsman friend. A woman with orange cat ears called out from a room as an armored figure stepped through the open doorway. Sure. Come back if you have any further questions, Mr. Edmund. I will. Rusty came out of a room holding a piece of parchment covered in numbers, all related to his new project, establishing a smithy within the city. Although he had secured rights to the decrepit building he was occupying, the situation turned out to be more complicated than he had expected. He had gone to the city hall to handle the last few legal requirements for opening his shop, but the meeting quickly became a tangle of unexpected bureaucracy. Under his arm was a small stack of papers he still needed to read and sign. While the city had first appeared to operate with little oversight, the reality was far more structured than he had realized. Running a shop involved taxation and multiple permits, some of which made little sense to him. One example was the mandatory hazard insurance fee, which was significantly higher because he lived in the slums, where crime was more prevalent. Why do I need to pay this? It's not like they're offering much protection. In theory, they'll assign a guard closer to your location to help with any thieves. Alexander replied as he tried to make sense of the policy. In theory. Rusty repeated, unconvinced, and soon even a burden jumped in. Ha, you humans have strange ways of extorting one another. I bet that guard never shows up, even if we pay the fee. Well. Alexander stopped himself from answering, but the reason was clear. A burden was right. The guards in the city followed specific patrol routes and were not eager to put themselves in danger for others. They protected the prominent merchant district, but when it came to the slums, they mostly stayed away. So this means I'll have to rely on myself. Not necessarily. You could always hire some adventurers. It would probably cost us less than what the city charges for protection. Alexander responded, and Rusty nodded. The city required a mandatory hazard insurance fee, but there was another option that offered actual protection. Unfortunately, it cost nearly 10 times more and was well beyond what Rusty could afford. Hiring a few E-rank adventurers to guard his home would cost about half that amount each month. He could spend even less by hiring mercenaries instead. There were a few viable options for Rusty's growing business, but he had not yet decided which one to choose. Sorry it took so long, Gleam. The queue was a lot longer than I expected. Why don't we head back to our lair? Gleam had been waiting outside and had nearly fallen asleep. Once he arrived, she took her usual place on his shoulder, and together they returned home. Gleam. As soon as they arrived, Gleam hopped off to play with the children while Rusty went down into the basement. He spread out all the paperwork and began reading. While he could have asked a burden for a summary, he wanted to understand everything himself and learn from the process. Rusty sat in the basement, surrounded by crumpled documents and neatly stacked parchments. He understood the importance of staying organized to avoid confusion later on. The fees for running the smithy were a concern, but they were manageable. He could earn money by selling monster parts or ingots, just as he had in the other city. If he managed to locate raw resources like iron or veins, he could easily refine them into ingots using the system he relied on. So many fees. No wonder humans struggle to survive in this world. As a monster, Rusty had no need for food or sleep. He required no upkeep and could live in a hole in the ground without being affected by the elements. Although his body would eventually begin to rust, it had become highly resistant over time, and repairs were simple as long as he had access to raw materials. The problem he faced now was unrelated to survival. It had to do with his second alter ego, the one meant to serve as the blacksmith. I should probably test it first. The body might need a few adjustments. It was time to try out one of the shell bodies he had built. The one he used in the city was designed to resemble an adventurer, but the one he planned to use in the smithy would need to be entirely different. Let's get the parts out first. In the spider-infested forest, he had found his first head, the head of an apprentice blacksmith. Along with it, he had discovered papers that included the man's name, Oswald. The head bore a scar on the cheek and was noticeably rounder than Edmund's, which forced Rusty to adjust the proportions of the human body he was constructing. While Oswald hadn't been a dwarf, Rusty designed the body to be stockier, with a broader frame and a prominent belly. The armor he crafted would reflect that shape and cover most of the body, incorporating far more leather than usual. Beneath the heavy leather gloves, smithing apron, and thick gambeson-style shirt, a concealed metal shell would lie hidden. It would remain invisible under the layers of cloth, but allow him to move it around through his skills. The result, he hoped, would be a convincing disguise, one that appeared entirely human while concealing the animated armor beneath. Rusty was a living armor monster who could primarily manipulate metal components. Although it was possible to include leather in the structure, it needed a certain degree of stiffness. Otherwise, it wouldn't hold together well. After observing how blacksmiths in the city dressed, he had a better understanding of what was typical. This led him to create a design that featured softer textiles than he had originally planned. Now then. With that, he began pulling out the parts and assembling them piece by piece. The components clanked as Rusty laid them out carefully on the table. The forge's glow cast a soft orange light across the workspace, illuminating the individual pieces that would form his second identity, Oswald the blacksmith. At first glance, the frame looked relatively normal. It was not much different from his usual body, only shorter and broader. Soon, he brought out a few items he had acquired from the city and began fitting them onto the frame to replicate the appearance of an ordinary person. He started with cloth pants and a thick grey shirt, followed by leather boots to cover the metallic greaves. Thick leather gloves went over his hands. To complete the look, he added a large leather apron with holsters on the sides for tools like hammers and tongs. Now for the last part. To finish the disguise, he needed a helmet. He had the man's head, but it required the right helmet to hold it in place. He spent some time considering his options, wanting something that would not draw suspicion. Then he found exactly what he needed in the city. Several dwarven craftsmen wore helmets similar in shape to his own face. Some used thick, flat face masks with narrow eye slits designed to shield them from the heat and sparks that flew up from their work. These armored helmets protected their beards and faces, making them ideal for concealing the dead man's head inside. "How does it look?" Rusty asked his guides as Alexander floated out of his helmet to examine the lifeless armor on the table. "Not sure. Can you make it move?" "I'll try." It was time to test it. He hadn't placed the blacksmith's head inside yet, but he activated his new skill called Puppet Armor. As the skill took hold, a soft glow spread across the motionless suit. A few seconds later, it began to move. The internal structure was made from plain iron to minimize mana use. Gradually, the magic settled, and the armor responded. "Now, rise up, my puppet." Rusty extended his hand as he gave the command. To anyone walking in he would look like a mad necromancer, but he didn't care. At first, the armor moved awkwardly, its motion stiff and unnatural. But after a few seconds, it sat up and then climbed down from the table. It stood still, awaiting the next order. Rusty began testing its responses. There was a reason he chose to use puppet armor instead of wearing the suit himself. He needed the construct to appear convincing, but he didn't plan to rely on it often. The blacksmith known as Oswald wasn't meant to leave his lair. His purpose was simple: to make the shop seem legitimate and divert suspicion away from Rusty. The construct needed to operate normally with Rusty nearby, so that no one suspected they were the same person. For that to work, Rusty's possession skill would also need to be pushed further than ever before. It needed to not only work when possessing one head, but two at a time. It was time for the final test. He retrieved Oswald's head from his spatial storage and carefully placed it onto the built-in support at the neck area of the armor. He had to handle it with care, since exposure to the elements without the possession skill would cause it to decay and start to smell. Once the head was securely fastened in place to prevent it from shifting, he lowered the helmet onto the puppet armor and stepped back. "How does it look now?" Rusty asked, and Alexander replied. "Like a dead blacksmith." A burden let out a cackling laugh at the sight of the lifeless head inside the armor. "Maybe you should become a Death Knight, Rusty. Start controlling undead instead. It would probably be easier than whatever this is." "A Death Knight? Aren't those high-level undead? Are they even living armors like me?" Before Rusty could continue questioning, Alexander floated close to his face and started speaking quickly. "Don't even think about becoming an undead monster, Rusty." From what Rusty knew, some living armors could move by being possessed by evil spirits. Death Knights, however, typically evolved from other undead creatures such as skeletons, zombies, or ghouls, or were created when a fallen knight was revived by a necromancer. They were powerful monsters, sometimes reaching rank A. "If it's an evil monster, won't I have to lean into the darkness element?" "I see what you're doing, a burden." Rusty shook his metal head. "Ha, was I caught already?" The black ball of light floated for a moment before settling above Rusty's left shoulder. Soon after, the testing resumed. Rusty's possession skill required him to place his helmet over another body. He was not entirely sure this method would work, since he was using a proxy body while remaining in his main form. Even so, he was a living suit of armor controlling another set of armor, so there was still a chance it could succeed. To improve the odds, he had raised his possession skill to the maximum level. If his guides were accurate, then something should happen to help him move forward. He felt mana leaving his body as he activated the possession skill on the head inside the other suit of armor. As expected, it did not work at first, so he had to try again and again. Even after several attempts and nearly draining his mana, there was little improvement, but he was not in a rush. If there was one thing he excelled at, it was repeating a task without growing bored. He continued the process without hesitation. Once his mana ran out, he simply waited or worked around his forge. When his mana returned, he activated the skill again. Then finally, after several hours, something began to happen. The head inside the other suit of armor started to open, and a message appeared in front of him. "Congratulations, possession has evolved into advanced possession." Yes. The process was a success. Once the skill evolved, the eyes of the head he placed in the armor began to open. It felt strange at first, but he gradually started to get used to it. Now that the skill was active, he could perceive the world through the head in the other suit of armor. This was not an easy task. He had to control his own body while also keeping track of the puppet, effectively splitting his mind in two. It was becoming increasingly difficult. This might take a while. Rusty concentrated on the growing mental divide between his two forms. He could sense both bodies, his main armored self and the puppet that was now Oswald the blacksmith. Controlling another body remotely felt exhausting at first, but he slowly gained control over the other head and began speaking through it. I'm Oswald, a blacksmith. The words came out slowly, some of them slurred, much like when he first learned to speak. Still, this was progress. Even though speaking through the puppet took intense focus and the results were far from perfect, it might be enough. As long as he could make it believable that this blacksmith lived and worked here, that would suffice. He also knew that as his possession skill improved, managing two heads at once would become easier. For now, it was nearly impossible. Is this my limit for now? Inside the puppet armor, the head remained under his control. There seemed to be a range limit of about 10 meters. If the puppet moved beyond that distance, the head would lose its connection. He gave Oswald a new command, to turn toward the forge and pick up a hammer. The motion was delayed and awkward, but it worked. That alone brought him satisfaction. When the puppet managed to swing the hammer, he felt genuine excitement. The Oswald puppet brought the hammer down onto an anvil with a loud clang. The movement was rough, but convincing enough to fool anyone who was not paying close attention. The sound echoed through the basement, disturbing a few mice hidden in the cracks between the stones. Still stiff. The shoulders aren't sinking with the elbows. Might look strange if someone watches him for too long. Alexander floated near the puppet's head, observing its movements, which seemed unrefined, but Rusty didn't care. That doesn't matter. Oswald is a shy smith who only works alone down here in the basement. A shy smith, hey. Rusty responded quickly, already having built an entire backstory for his second identity. Now that the puppet could move, he could shift his focus to other tasks, like earning money to launch his new business and gaining more levels to grow stronger. He was a D-rank monster now, but he had no intention of staying that way for long.